call me Sheriff Tom Grady. I've worn this badge for 30 years, and I've seen my fair share of ugliness, robberies gone bad, drug deals and tumbleweed towns, family feuds that ended with blood on the dirt. But there's one case that still makes the hair on my neck stand up, even now. Folks around here whisper about it like it's a ghost story, but I know better. I was there. This happened about 10 years ago, out near the old Diablo Crossroads, a desolate stretch of highway cutting through nothing but scrubland and shadows. The name wasn't for show. Stories about that place go back to the 1800s. Cowboys claimed they'd hear hoofbeats at night, but no rider. Trucks would break down for no reason, and people would swear they saw lights flickering in the distance, like lanterns being carried by invisible hands. On the night in question, I was heading home after a late shift. The town was quiet. It was one of those rare times when crime takes a back seat to the heat. My deputy, young Bobby Mathers, had just left for the night. I was the last one out, locking up the station like I always did. About halfway home, my radio crackled to life. It was faint at first, like static, but then I heard a woman's voice, soft, shaky, like she was holding back tears. "Help. Please." "He's coming." I grabbed the mic. "Ma'am, this is Sheriff Grady. What's your location?" Nothing but static. Then, clearer this time, the crossroads. "He's here." Her voice cut out, and my stomach tightened like a coiled spring. Diablo Crossroads was only 5 miles from where I was. I hit the lights and floored it, the cruiser eating up the asphalt like a hungry dog. When I got there, the night was blacker than a preacher's hat. My headlights swept over the intersection, but all I saw were weeds and dust. No cars, no people. I killed the engine, and the silence felt heavy, like the air itself was waiting for something to happen. Then I saw it just past the ditch on the east side of the road. A car, an old Ford, sitting there with its driver's door wide open. The hood was dented like it had hit something solid, but there was no sign of what. "Sheriff," the voice came from behind me, and I damn near jumped out of my boots. I swung around, hand on my sidearm, but all I saw was a woman standing in the road. Her dress was torn, her hair wild, and her face, God, her face was pale as the moon. "Ma'am, are you hurt?" I asked, stepping closer. She didn't answer. She just pointed down the road, her finger trembling like a leaf in the wind. "He's coming," she said. I turned to look, and that's when I heard it. A low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It wasn't an animal sound, not exactly. It was deeper, darker, like the earth itself was groaning. The headlights of my cruiser flickered, and for a split second, I saw him, or it, standing in the distance. A tall figure, too tall to be a man, its outline shimmering like heat waves on the horizon. Its eyes burned like coals, and I swear I felt them boring into me, right down to my soul. I drew my gun, even though I knew it wouldn't do a damn thing. The woman grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin like claws. "Don't look at him," she whispered. "He'll take you." And just like that, she was gone. I don't mean she ran off or faded into the dark. I mean she disappeared, as if she'd never been there at all. The growling stopped, and so did the figure. For a long time, I just stood there, my gun shaking in my hand, waiting for whatever it was to make the next move. But it didn't. The air felt lighter, the silence less oppressive. I holstered my weapon and made my way back to the cruiser, half expecting it not to start, but it did. I never found that woman, and no one ever reported a missing person that matched her description. The car belonged to a man named David Grayson, but he'd vanished weeks earlier. They found his wallet and keys inside, but no sign of him. Diablo Crossroads still has a reputation. People avoid it when they can, and when they can't, they pray before crossing. As for me, I take the long way home these days. Some roads are best left untraveled. The name's Sheriff Tom Grady, and if you're tuning in tonight, I've got another story for you. Like I've said before, this badge has seen a lot of strange things over the years, but what happened out in Red Hollow? That one still gets under my skin. Now, Red Hollow isn't on any map. It's an old settlement about 20 miles south of town, abandoned back in the 1930s after a drought dried up the creek and the jobs. What's left of it is nothing but broken down shacks and a church that looks like it's holding itself together with spit and prayers. Folks say it's cursed, but folks around here say a lot of things. I didn't put much stock in it until the summer of '99. It started with a call from a rancher named Dale McKinney. He owned a spread on the edge of Red Hollow, and he swore up and down that somebody or something was slaughtering his cattle. Said he'd wake up in the morning to find them mutilated, their eyes and tongues missing, with no tracks or blood trail to speak of. Coyotes don't do this, Sheriff, Dale told me, his voice shaking like a leaf in a storm. This is something else. Now, I've dealt with cattle mutilations before, usually kids messing around or the occasional predator, but the way Dale described it, I figured I'd better see for myself. That night, I drove out to his place with my deputy, Bobby Mathers. Dale met us at the gate, his rifle slung over one shoulder, and led us out to the pasture. Sure enough, there was a dead steer, lying on its side like it had just dropped dead where it stood. Its eyes were gone, and its tongue was missing, just like Dale said. But the weirdest thing, there wasn't a single drop of blood anywhere, not on the ground, not on the animal. It was like something had drained it dry. We set up a watch that night, me and Bobby in the truck, Dale on his porch. The moon was high, casting just enough light to make out the shapes of the cattle grazing in the distance. It was quiet to quiet. No crickets, no wind, just the sound of our own breathing. Around midnight, Bobby nudged me. "Sheriff, you see that?" At first, I thought he was pointing at the cattle, but then I saw it a light, faint and flickering, moving through the trees on the edge of the pasture. It wasn't a flashlight, and it sure as hell wasn't a lantern. It was cold, blue, and unnatural. We got out of the truck, guns drawn, and started toward the trees. Every step felt heavier than the last, like the air itself was trying to push us back. The light disappeared as we get closer, but then we heard it a low, guttural moan that made my stomach turn. "Sheriff," Bobby whispered, his voice tight. "What the hell is that?" Before I could answer, something came rushing out of the trees, something fast and dark, too quick to make out. It hit Bobby hard, knocking him to the ground, and I fired off a shot without thinking. The thing didn't even flinch. It just vanished into the night, leaving Bobby gasping for air and clutching his chest. We didn't see any more lights after that, but the moaning didn't stop. It followed us all the way back to the truck, growing louder and closer with every step. By the time we got inside and locked the doors, it sounded like it was right outside. But when I shined my spotlight into the dark, there was nothing there. We left Dale to his own devices that night, much as I hated to. I told him to stay inside and lock his doors, but honestly, I don't think it would have made a difference. The next morning, we went back to the station and tried to make sense of what we'd seen. Bobby wanted to call it quits, and I didn't blame him. But something about Red Hollow kept gnawing at me, like an itch I couldn't scratch. A few days later, I drove back out there on my own. Dale was gone, his truck, his cattle, his house, everything. It was like he'd packed up and left in the middle of the night. I never saw Dale again, and I don't know what took him or his cattle. All I know is this: Red Hollow is a place where the rules of nature don't apply, where the past lingers like a bad smell, and where the dead aren't as quiet as they should be. If you ever find yourself driving through the Texas backroads and see a sign for Red Hollow, do yourself a favor. Keep driving. Some places are forgotten for a reason. Name's Sheriff Tom Grady, back with another story. I don't tell this one much, mostly because folks look at me like I've been hitting the bottle when I do. But it happened, and I've got the scars to prove it's scars you can't see, but you can damn well feel. This was back in 2005, during one of those blistering Texas summers where the heat feels alive, like it's trying to suffocate you. I got a call from a family camping out at Stillwater Lake, a man-made reservoir a couple hours from town. Now, Stillwater's got a reputation, not a good one. Before the dam was built, there was a small town there called Finch Creek. They flooded it when the reservoir was created in the 1950s, and ever since, folks have claimed the lake is haunted. The story goes that the townsfolk didn't take kindly to being forced out, and when the water started to rise, some refused to leave. They drowned with their homes, their church, their lives, and their anger stayed behind. Swimmers report feeling unseen hands pulling at their ankles. Fishermen hear voices whispering from below, and at night, well, that's when it gets worse. I always figured it was just campfire talk to keep kids out of trouble, but that night, I learned otherwise. The call came in around p.m. A man named Eddie Morales said his teenage son, Lucas, had gone missing. They'd been camping by the North Shore, near the old boat ramp, and Lucas went to grab some firewood. He never came back. I headed out there with my deputy, Bobby Mather's same guy from the Red Hollow story. Bobby looked uneasy the whole ride. "Sheriff, you know what they say about Stillwater, right?" "Yeah, I know," I said. "And we're gonna find a scared teenager, not a ghost." When we got to the campsite, Eddie was pacing near the fire, his wife sitting on a log with her hands clasped in prayer. The place had that eerie, quiet Stillwater's known for no frogs, no crickets, just the soft lap of water against the shore. "He went that way," Eddie said, pointing toward a trail that disappeared into the trees. "It's been over an hour." Bobby and I grabbed flashlights and followed the trail. The beam of my light cut through the darkness, illuminating trees that seemed too close, too gnarled, like they were leaning in to watch us. The air was heavy, and with every step, it felt like we were walking into a trap. About 20 minutes in, we found Lucas's flashlight lying in the dirt, still on. No sign of the boy, though. Bobby picked it up, his face pale. "This ain't right, Sheriff," I couldn't argue. Something about that place felt wrong, like the ground didn't want us there. We kept going, calling Lucas's name. The trail ended at a clearing, and beyond that was the lake, dark and still as glass. My light caught something on the shore, a pile of clothes, neatly folded. "Sheriff," Bobby's voice cracked. "That's not normal." "Lucas," I shouted, stepping closer. The clothes were dry, but there were wet footprints leading into the water, bare and small, like a kid's. We scanned the surface with our flashlights, but all we saw was our own reflections. Then the water rippled. At first, I thought it was just a fish, but then I saw her, a woman standing waist deep in the lake, her long hair floating like black ribbons on the water. She was facing away from us, but there was something about the way she moved, slow and deliberate, that made my stomach knot. "Ma'am," I called out, my voice shaking. "You need help?" She didn't answer. She just started walking further into the lake, her body disappearing inch by inch until all that was left was her head. And then she was gone. The water erupted. Bobby screamed, and I pulled my gun, not knowing what the hell I was aiming at. A shadow rose from the lake, black and shapeless, with glowing eyes that burned like embers. It moved fast, and before I knew it, Bobby was on the ground, gasping for air, claw marks raking across his chest. I fired 3 shots, and the thing disappeared, sinking back into the water like smoke. The lake went still again, and all we could hear was Bobby's ragged breathing. We never found Lucas. The Morells family packed up and left that night, and I can't say I blame them. The official report said drowning, but I know better. That lake took him just like it's taken others. Stillwater's quiet now, but if you go there on a moonless night, you might hear the whispers, see the shadows. And if you do, my advice is simple: run. Not everything that's lost wants to be found. Evening, folks. It's Sheriff Tom Grady again, and I've got another tale for you. Now, you might think you've heard it all by now, but this one keeps me up some nights. It's about a little girl, just a kid really. But what I saw in her eyes was anything but innocent. This happened in the fall of 2012, out near Hollow Creek. That stretch of road is nothing but gravel, scrub brush, and shadows. Folks around here don't like driving it at night, not since the bridge collapsed back in the 70s. A school bus went over, and 15 kids drowned in the creek below. They say you can still hear them crying if the wind's right. I always figured it was just an old wives' tale. One night, I was patrolling near Hollow Creek when I got a call from a woman named Carla Dean. She lived out there alone in a trailer, tucked back in the woods. Carla was the type who'd call about a raccoon knocking over her trash cans, so when she said she needed help, I didn't think much of it. "She's at my door, Sheriff," Carla whispered, her voice trembling. "She just keeps knocking." "Who's knocking?" I asked, already starting my cruiser. "A little girl," Carla said. "She's all alone, but something ain't right. She's a skin to come inside, but her eyes. Sheriff, her eyes ain't normal." Now, I'm not one to jump at ghost stories, but something about the way Carla sounded like she was hanging on by a thread made my skin crawl. When I pulled up to Carla's place, it was pitch black. Her trailer sat at the end of a long, rutted driveway, the only light coming from the porch where she was huddled in a rocking chair, clutching a shotgun. "She's gone now," Carla said as I stepped out of the car. "But she was here, Sheriff. Knockin' and knockin', a skin to come in." I told her no, and she just stood there, smiling, like she knew something I didn't. Did she say anything else? I asked. Just kept calling me ma'am and saying she was lost, but I wasn't buying it. Her eyes, they were black, Sheriff. Black as coal. I checked around the property, but didn't find any sign of the girl. No footprints, no scuff marks, nothing. I chalked it up to Carla's nerves and told her to keep the door locked and call me if the girl came back. I was halfway back to the station when I saw her. She was standing in the middle of the road, barefoot, wearing a white dress that looked about 2 sizes too small. Her hair hung in tangled strands around her face, and when I hit the brakes, she turned to look at me. I've seen some terrible things in my time, but that look, it froze me to the bone. Her eyes were black, just like Carla said, no whites, no pupils, just an endless, inky void. I rolled down the window, keeping my hand on my holster. "You all right, sweetheart? You lost?" She didn't answer, just tilted her head like a dog hearing a strange noise. Then she smiled wide and toothy, like she was enjoying some private joke. "Can I come in, Sheriff?" she asked, her voice soft and sweet, like honey dripping off a blade. "Where are your parents?" I asked. my voice steady even though my heart was pounding. "They're waiting for me," she said, "down by the creek. But I need a ride. Now, I might be a fool, but I ain't stupid." Every instinct I had was screaming at me to stay in the car, to keep the door locked tight. "Why don't you wait right there?" I said. "I'll call for help." Her smile faded, and for a second, I swear her eyes turned darker, like the night was swallowing them up. "That's not how it works, Sheriff," she said. Before I could blink, she was gone. 1 second she was there, and the next, the road was empty. I don't remember driving back to the station, but when I got there, Bobby took one look at me and asked what the hell happened. I told him about the girl, and he just nodded, his face grim. "You've seen her, huh?" he said. "They call her the Black-Eyed Girl. People have been seeing her for years, always near Hollow Creek. Some say she's one of the kids from the bus. Others think she's something older, something worse. I never saw her again after that, but I know she's still out there, wandering those back roads, knocking on doors, looking for someone to let her in. So if you're ever driving near Hollow Creek and you see a little girl in a white dress, don't stop. Keep driving, and whatever you do, don't let her in." Evening, folks. Sheriff Tom Grady here, back with another story from these parts. This one's a little different, I reckon, and it's been gnawing at me for years. Now, Texas is big. You drive an hour in any direction, and you'll hit a place that's practically a ghost town, or worse, a place that used to be one. Shady Creek's one of those spots, though I never thought much of it until the day I saw something I can't explain. This was about 6 years ago, in the spring of 2018. I was on a late-night patrol, just doing the usual sweep through the back roads and stretches of highway. The kind of job that lets you clear your head, even if there's not much to think about. It was one of those dark, moonless nights that seemed to swallow sound. The only light I had was from my headlights, cutting through the thick fog rolling in from the creek. Now I'd heard about Shady Creek, sure. There's a bridge out there that's been closed for years, but people still go out there sometimes, thinking they can shortcut their way to the highway. A few folks have vanished over the years, but nothing solid ever came of it. Mostly rumors old-timers talk about the ghost of a woman who drowned their back in the 40S. Folks say she's still looking for her children. I never gave much weight to stories like that. Ghosts are for campfires and kids' stories, right? But that night, I learned just how wrong I was. I was passing the old bridge around AM when I noticed something out of place. A car parked near the side of the road, just sitting there like it was waiting. I pulled up behind it, flashing my lights. It wasn't unusual for someone to break down out here, so I figured I'd give a hand. But as I stepped out of my cruiser, something felt off. Like I wasn't the only one there. I knocked on the driver's side window. There was a man inside, slumped over the wheel. His clothes were soaked, and his face was pale, almost like he'd seen a ghost. I tapped again, louder this time, but he didn't move. My gut told me something wasn't right, so I pulled the door open. The second I touched the handle, the man's body jerked upright, eyes wide, staring at me like he was seeing something behind me. He didn't say a word, but his mouth was moving like he was trying to scream. His breath was shallow, and there was a wild look in his eyes, like he had been through hell and come back, and wasn't sure if he liked it. "Hey, buddy," I said, grabbing his shoulder. "You okay?" His lips trembled, and he gasped, "She's still out there." "She'll get me next." "Who?" I asked, but the man didn't answer. His eyes glazed over, and he slumped back in his seat like all the fight had drained out of him. I pulled him out of the car and called for backup, But before anyone else could arrive, the man slipped away, dead right there in my hands. Heart failure, the doc said, but I knew better. I didn't leave right away. Something made me look around like I was being watched. That's when I saw the figure standing at the edge of the creek, just beyond the bridge. A woman. She was dressed in what looked like an old-fashioned white gown, soaked through like she'd been pulled from the water herself. Her hair hung down in long wet strands, and she wasn't moving, just staring at me. My first thought was that it was some kind of trick, maybe a prank, but there was something wrong about her. The air got colder the closer I got, and the fog around the creek seemed to thicken, swallowing the ground beneath my boots. I called out to her, "Ma'am, you need help?" She didn't respond, just stood there. Then slowly, like she had all the time in the world, she began to turn toward me. Her face was pale, impossibly pale, and her eyes were like empty black holes, like the night itself had consumed her soul. I couldn't move, couldn't look away. Every instinct told me to run, but I stood there, frozen, watching her get closer. I swear to you, it felt like she was dragging the fog with her, like it was part of her, like she was the one controlling it. The sound of rushing water grew louder, louder than the creek had ever been. Then the woman stopped, and for a moment, everything went still, like the world held its breath. Suddenly, I heard a voice, low and distant, echoing from the fog. It wasn't hers. It was the voice of a child, a boy. He was crying, calling for help, pleading for someone to save him. I snapped out of my trance and ran toward the creek, but when I reached the edge, the woman was gone. There was no sign of anyone, just the sound of the creek rushing beneath the bridge. The backup finally arrived, and I told them what happened, though I don't think any of them believed me. The body of the man who had been in the car, gone. The car was still there, but there was no trace of him anywhere. No prints, no blood, nothing. I don't go near Shady Creek much these days. Every time I drive past that bridge, I hear the crying again, feel the chill in the air. And sometimes, just sometimes, I see her standing at the water's edge, waiting. So, if you ever find yourself near Shady Creek on a foggy night, do yourself a favor. Keep your eyes on the road. Don't stop. Don't even look. Because if you do, she'll know you're there, and she'll be coming for you too. Well, looks like you came back for another one. I'm Sheriff Tom Grady, and I've been around long enough to see a lot of things. Things most folks wouldn't believe if I told them. But I ain't one to lie, especially not about what I saw one summer evening out by the old oak tree near Mount Pleasant. You see, the tree's been around longer than this town, longer than anyone can remember, and it's seen more things than any one person could ever hope to forget. This was back in 2014. I was on duty one evening, working the night shift, when I got a call from a farmer up north, near the edge of town. His name was Billy Thompson, old as dirt. Good man, but he called me in a voice I'd never heard before. His hands were shaking so badly, I could hear it through the phone. "Sheriff, you need to come quick. There's something under the oak," he said, his voice strained. "Billy, what are you talking about?" I asked. "You've been drinking, haven't you?" "No, Sheriff," he said, almost frantic now. "It ain't like that. Please, you've got to come." Now, I'll admit, I didn't think much of it. The old oak tree had been there since the late 1800s, and folks around here like to tell stories about it, ghost stories mostly. Stories of strange noises in the night, of lights flickering under the branches when there ain't no one around. I figured it was just one of those tall tales. But there was something in Billy's voice. He wasn't the type to joke around, especially not about something like this. So, I got in my cruiser and headed out there, not expecting much. When I arrived at Billy's farm, it was the same old scene. A dusty road, a dilapidated farmhouse, and the massive oak tree looming over the land like it was watching me. I walked up to Billy's porch and knocked, but there was no answer. "Billy," I called out, stepping into the house. It was dark inside, and the air was thick with dust and old wood. That's when I heard him. He was in the backyard, shouting my name. I rushed out the back door, and there he was, standing a few feet from the oak, pointing at the ground with a trembling hand. I could see his face in the moonlight, and let me tell you, it wasn't the face of a man I'd ever seen before. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, and there was this look of pure terror in them, something more than fear, something that made my stomach drop. "Billy, what is it?" I asked, trying to steady my voice, though my heart was pounding. He didn't answer, just nodded toward the ground. I followed his gaze, and that's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, but when I squinted, I could see it clear as day. The earth under the oak was moving, not in the way it does when the wind blows or when animals burrow down in the dirt. No, this was something else. The ground was buckling, as if something underneath was pushing up, like it was alive. My first thought was that there had been some kind of sinkhole or cave-in, but I wasn't stupid. I knew there was something else going on here, something I couldn't explain. "Billy, what the hell is that?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. Billy just shook his head, his lips trembling. "I don't know, Sheriff. I don't know, but I've seen it before. My father saw it too, and his father before him." I glanced at Billy, confused. "What are you talking about?" He pointed at the tree, and I followed his finger, looking up at the massive oak. It was then I realized it wasn't just the ground that was moving, it was the tree too. The branches were twisting, bending in ways that trees don't bend. It was like it was alive, like the oak itself was reaching for something or someone. And then I heard it. A low, guttural growl, deep in the earth. I froze. It wasn't the growl of an animal. No, this was something darker, something unnatural. Billy took a step back, his face as pale as a ghost. "It's coming, Sheriff." "It's been waiting." I didn't know what he meant, but I didn't stick around to find out. I grabbed Billy's arm and started to pull him away, but he yanked himself free, his eyes wide with terror. "No, we can't leave. It'll get us. It'll take us like it took my father." I didn't have time to think. Something I couldn't see was moving under the ground, something that made the air feel thick and wrong. The branches of the oak creaked and groaned, and I swear to God, I saw shadows in the dark. Dark shapes, slithering in the branches, in the dirt, crawling toward us. Then, just as quickly as it started, the noise stopped. The earth went still, and the tree returned to its normal, quiet state. The fog in the air seemed to lift, and the night went calm again. Billy was still standing there, shaking, but there was no sign of whatever it was that had been beneath the oak. Nothing. "You see it now, Sheriff?" Billy asked, his voice hoarse. "You see what's been under the tree all these years?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. I didn't know what I'd seen, and I sure as hell didn't know how to explain it. I just knew that whatever it wasn't done. It wasn't finished. It was still down there, waiting. I left Billy's farm that night, but I haven't been back to that oak since. They say there are things buried under that tree, things older than time itself. And I'll tell you one thing: if you ever find yourself near Mount Pleasant on a quiet night, and you see that old oak in the distance, don't go near it, because whatever's down there, it's waiting for you. Evening, folks. Sheriff Tom Grady here. Some of you might have heard the stories I've told before, but let me tell ya, there's one more that sticks with me, one I don't like talking about much. You'll understand why in a minute. This one goes back to 2012, and it happened out on Route 84, that lonely stretch of highway that cuts through the dry, cracked land between Odessa and Lubbock. Now, Route 84 ain't much to look at, just miles of open space, dust, and the occasional cactus. Ain't many folks drive through there unless they've got a reason to be in the middle of nowhere. And that night, well, I had no reason to be out there either, but I was. I was coming back from a call in Lubbock, and I had about an hour left of the drive before I'd be back home. It was around a.m., dark as a well, with only the hum of my cruiser's engine cutting through the silence. I was tired, not thinking much about anything, just watching the road ahead, when something caught my eye in the rearview mirror. A set of headlights distant, but coming fast. Now, there ain't much out there, so I figured it was another trucker or some late-night traveler, but when the lights got closer, something didn't feel right. The truck didn't pass me. Instead, it pulled up alongside my car. It was a big old Chevy truck, beat up like it had been on the road for decades. The kind you only see in movies, rusted out with dents on the side. The driver didn't look over at me, just kept his eyes on the road ahead, and for a second, I thought, maybe this guy's just drunk and swerving, but then he did something that made me freeze. He waved. Now I was the one driving. Why would he wave at me? I glanced over at him, and that's when I saw it. His face, pale like he hadn't seen the sun in years. His eyes were wide, unblinking. He looked like he'd been awake for days, maybe weeks. His mouth opened like he was trying to say something, but no sound came out. Then he slammed his hand against the window, so hard I thought it might break. "Help me," he mouthed over and over, but it didn't make sense. I was already a mile outside of town. No one was supposed to be out here at this hour. The truck sped ahead, but I was already reaching for the radio. Something didn't sit right. I radioed in for a patrol unit to check the area. I told myself I was just being paranoid, but something about the whole thing felt wrong. I should have listened to that gut feeling. About 5 miles down the road, I saw the truck again. But this time, it was parked on the side of the highway. It was sitting there in the middle of nowhere, under a stretch of broken, flickering streetlights. I pulled over, turned on my siren. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The air felt heavier, like something was pressing down on me. I walked up to the driver's side of the truck, and the door was wide open. The keys were still in the ignition, the engine running, but there was no driver. I searched the truck, nothing. No sign of the guy. No wallet, no phone, no jacket. Nothing. But the seat was warm. The smell of stale sweat lingered in the air. My flashlight swept across the truck's interior, and that's when I saw something I'll never forget. There were scratches on the dashboard, deep, frantic marks, like someone had been clawing at it. And as I moved the light down, I noticed something under the seat. A small bundle, wrapped in cloth. I pulled it out, and inside the bundle was a torn piece of leather, part of a jacket stained dark. And something else. Something that shouldn't have been there. A bone. I froze. It wasn't an animal bone. It was human. A finger bone, broken and jagged. My stomach turned, and I swear I felt the temperature drop around me. I stepped away from the truck, my heart pounding in my chest. That's when I heard it. A voice. A soft whisper, barely audible over the wind. But it wasn't coming from anywhere near the truck. It was coming from further up the road. Out there, just beyond the reach of my headlights. "Help me. Help me. The whisper came again, louder this time, and I realized it was calling my name. I knew there wasn't a soul for miles. No one could have been out there. But I grabbed my radio and called for backup anyway, even though I could feel the dread creeping up my spine. I wasn't sure if I wanted to know what was out there, but I had to go. I followed the sound of the voice, walking further into the darkness. The road ahead was empty, stretched out like a black ribbon under the sky, but the whisper kept calling my name, getting louder as I walked. It wasn't just a whisper anymore, it was a scream, a frantic cry for help. And then, just as I reached the end of the road, I saw something. A shadow, a shape, a person standing in the middle of the highway. It was the man from the truck. His face was twisted, eyes wide and bulging. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. He raised his hand, but it was wrong. His fingers bent at odd angles, twisted like something had broken them. And then he collapsed, right there in the middle of the road. I ran toward him, but when I reached him, he was gone. Not a trace. Just an empty stretch of highway and the sound of my heart pounding in my ears. I don't know what happened that night. I don't know what I saw, or who that man was. But when I got back to my cruiser, the radio crackled to life, and the voice on the other end was clear as day. "Sheriff Grady," the dispatcher said. "We've got a report of a missing man. Last seen driving a Chevy truck on Route 84. The hairs stood up on the back of my neck." The voice on the radio was the same voice I'd heard out there, calling my name. There are a lot of things I can't explain, but I know one thing for sure. Route 84 isn't just a stretch of road. It's a place where something lost is waiting to find you. And once it does, you might not ever be seen again. So, if you're ever out that way, especially after dark, keep your eyes on the road. Don't stop. Don't even think about it. Because once you hear the cry for help, it's already too late. I don't know how long it's been since that night, but I can still smell the air, the dust and heat of West Texas clinging to the evening like an old coat. It was back in '07, and I was just a young deputy at the time. Not a full-blown sheriff yet, but close enough that the older guys were letting me handle a few of the easier calls. You know, the ones that didn't require a lot of brains, just a pair of hands and a strong back. This one, though, well, it wasn't like any other call I'd been on. It started like any other shift, just another routine night in the middle of nowhere. I was cruising down the long stretch of County Road 81, the headlights cutting through the darkness, watching for anything suspicious: drunks, lost travelers, maybe a coyote darting across the road. Nothing too unusual. That was until I saw her. Now, the thing about West Texas is, you don't get too many people out in the middle of nowhere, especially on roads like 81. It's mostly farmland and ranches, with the occasional abandoned house or shack that looks like it's been there since the Dust Bowl. But there she was, standing on the side of the road. A woman. She looked wrong, like she didn't belong there. It was late, almost AM, and there weren't any streetlights out here. Just the glow of my headlights catching her in an eerie, unnatural light. She wasn't waving me down or acting like she needed help, but she was standing there, still as a statue, staring out into the dark. I pulled over, slow, cautious. It wasn't often you saw someone out here, especially at this hour. As I got closer, I could see that her clothes were old, out of date. A faded dress, like something from the 50s or 60s, and her hair, long and black, was tangled like she hadn't bothered brushing it in days. I stepped out of my cruiser, my boots kicking up the dust beneath me. "Ma'am," I called, trying to keep my voice calm, professional. "You all right?" She didn't answer. Now, I'm not a guy who spooks easy. I've seen enough in this job to know better than to jump at shadows. But something about the way she stood there, motionless, like she was waiting for something, it sent a chill down my spine. I took another step forward, and that's when I saw her face. Her eyes. They were wide open, but they didn't look human. They were too big, too dark, and the more I looked at them, the more I realized that they weren't eyes at all. They were just black hollows, like the sockets were empty. There was no life in them, no reflection, just darkness. My stomach turned, and my breath caught in my throat. "Ma'am," I said, stepping back a little, trying to steady myself. "Are you all right?" Still, she didn't answer. She just stood there, swaying slightly, like the wind was pushing her in a way that didn't make sense. Her head tilted just enough to make me feel like I was being studied, but there was nothing about her that felt human anymore. I could feel the weight of her gaze, like she was looking into me, through me, right into the deepest part of my soul. Now, at this point, I should have walked away. I should have radioed in and waited for backup. But for some damn reason, I didn't. I kept walking toward her. I reached out a hand, stupid, I know, and I tried to touch her shoulder. When my fingers brushed her skin, it was colder than it had any right to be. It was like touching the stone of an old gravestone, the kind you find in forgotten cemeteries. That's when I heard it. A voice. A whisper, but it wasn't hers. It wasn't coming from her at all. "Get out." The whisper was so faint, I almost didn't hear it over the hum of the night. But it was clear enough to make my heart skip a beat. I jerked back, my hand pulling away from her, but it was like I couldn't move fast enough. Like my legs were stuck in cement. And then, in the blink of an eye, she was gone. Vanished. I stood there, frozen in place, trying to make sense of what just happened. My breath was coming too fast, my hands shaking. There was no way she could have disappeared like that. She hadn't moved. She hadn't even made a sound. And yet, she was gone. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at the empty road, before I realized I had to go. I couldn't just stand there forever. But as I turned to get back into my cruiser, I heard it again, the whisper. "Get out." I glanced over my shoulder, expecting to see her again, but there was nothing. Just the empty stretch of road, dark and quiet. But the voice, it stayed with me. It lingered, hanging in the air like a bad smell, even after I started the engine and drove away. Later, I found out what happened to her. The local records showed a woman named Clara Fitzgerald, who had been reported missing in 1963. She had been traveling with her husband, who was found dead in a car accident out by the highway just a mile or so from where I'd seen her. Clara's body was never found. They said she disappeared without a trace, like the earth had swallowed her whole. They assumed she'd either run off or, maybe, just maybe, had met a worse fate. I don't know what happened that night. I don't know if it was her spirit or something else entirely. But that woman, with those hollow eyes, wasn't like anyone I've ever seen. She was something. Lost. Trapped. The whispers, though. The way she disappeared. It still haunts me to this day. Sometimes when I'm driving down that stretch of road late at night, I swear I can hear her voice, carried on the wind. And I keep thinking, what if it's not a warning? What if it's a plea? What if she's still out there, waiting for someone to listen? So, if you're ever out there on Route 81, late at night, watch the side of the road. Be careful, because some things you don't want to find, some things, might just find you first. I've worked a lot of strange cases in my time as a sheriff, but there's one that still eats at me, even all these years later. It happened back in 2011, during a summer that felt hotter than the usual Texas scorch. That year, the heat kept people inside, but it didn't stop the weirdness that's sometimes part of the job, especially out here in the Pine Hollow area, an old stretch of land with more stories than anyone really cares to repeat. This particular night, though, there wasn't much going on. The radio crackled with the usual, keep your eyes peeled, and all quiet on the west front, but the silence always felt too thick out there. Like the land was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Around PM, I got a call. A missing person. Now, people go missing out here all the time. Either they're drunk and passed out in a ditch somewhere, or they wander too far into the woods and lose their way. But this time, it was different. It was a boy 12 years old. His name was Lucas. His family lived just outside Pine Hollow in an old ranch house. His mother called it in. Said Lucas had gone out for a walk that evening and never came back. She was frantic, her voice shaking, like she had a feeling something was wrong from the get-go. I grabbed my gear and headed out there, figuring it would be a straightforward search. Maybe he'd wandered too far, gotten spooked by the coyotes or some wild boar. But when I arrived at the ranch house, things didn't feel right. The air was too still, like the place had been abandoned for years, even though the lights were on inside. It was that kind of eerie quiet that sets your nerves on edge. I knocked on the door, and Lucas's mother opened it. She was pale, shaking, and barely able to speak at first. It was like she'd already been through hell and back. "He's gone," she kept saying. "He's gone, Sheriff. He's just gone." I asked her to explain exactly what had happened, and as she spoke, something didn't add up. She told me Lucas had been playing outside, chasing after his dog, a scrappy mutt named Benny, when he just disappeared. The dog was still there, barking at the back gate, but Lucas wasn't. She assumed he had wandered off, but when she went out to call him back inside, that's when she noticed the tracks footprints leading toward the woods behind the house. The thing about Pine Hollow is that there's a stretch of trees back there, thick and dark, even in the daytime. A lot of people say the woods have a mind of their own, that they don't let you in without a fight. But I didn't think much of that at the time. I thought it was just superstition. I grabbed a flashlight and told her I'd go into the woods, start looking for him. I didn't want to waste time, and we had a lot of ground to cover. It wasn't until I crossed the line of trees that the feeling in the pit of my stomach changed. The further I walked, the quieter it got. The night sounds disappeared. No owls, no insects. Just the rustling of leaves under my boots and the occasional snap of a branch in the distance. The trees were thick, almost closing in on me, and I kept calling out for Lucas, my voice echoing back at me in a way that felt wrong. After about an hour, I found something. It wasn't Lucas, but it was enough to make my heart race. There, in a small clearing, was a tree stump, and sitting on top of it, like it had been placed there, was Lucas's red baseball cap. I felt a shiver crawl up my spine as I picked it up. It was the boy's favorite cap. I'd seen him wearing it around town 1,000 times. But there was something strange about it now, something cold about it, like it had been out there for much longer than a few hours. And then there was the smell. It was faint, but it was there. A sickly sweet stench, like something rotten, but not quite decayed. I kept walking, hoping to find more clues, but it wasn't long before the forest started to change around me. The trees grew taller, and the path grew narrower. It was like I was being led deeper into the woods by something I couldn't see. Every time I turned my head, I swore I saw something flicker between the trees, just out of my line of sight. Then I heard it. A voice. Soft at first, like a whisper in the wind. Help. Me. I froze, my heart stopping for a second. It was coming from ahead. I couldn't tell if it was Lucas or someone else, but I had to follow it. I don't know how long I walked, but it felt like hours. And then, out of nowhere, there he was. Lucas. But he wasn't the same. He was standing in the middle of a small clearing, his face blank, his eyes wide and unblinking, staring at me. His clothes were torn, covered in dirt, and his hair was matted with something that looked like mud, but darker, almost black. He didn't move when I called his name, didn't even react when I took a step toward him. It was like he was frozen in time, trapped in a place between here and somewhere else. And then something happened that I'll never forget. His mouth opened, but it wasn't his voice that came out. Leave him. Leave him alone. I turned around, my hand instinctively reaching for my gun. But there was no one there. I looked back at Lucas, and that's when I saw it. His eyes. Those eyes weren't his anymore. They were empty, hollow, just dark holes where his soul should have been. I don't remember how I got back to the house, but I did. The next morning, we found Lucas again. He was lying in the same clearing where I'd seen him, curled up in a ball like he'd never moved. When they brought him back to town, he couldn't speak, couldn't remember anything that had happened. But I knew he'd been taken by whatever lurks in those woods. And whatever it was, it wanted something. It wanted Lucas, and it nearly got him. To this day, every time I drive past Pine Hollow, I swear I can see someone or something moving between the trees. And I keep wondering if Lucas will ever remember what happened to him out there. Maybe he will. Maybe he won't. But whatever it was in those woods, it still calls to him. And it's still waiting for someone else to listen. It's been a long time since I've told anyone about the night I spent in Devil's Canyon. Not because I'm scared, but because there's something in those hills that shouldn't be talked about. I've seen it with my own eyes, and I still don't know what to make of it. I don't even know if I want to. This happened about 5 years ago, back in 2019. I'd been with the department long enough to know that strange things happen out here in the Texas Hill Country. People vanish, animals act weird, and the land has a way of making you feel like you're being watched. But Devil's Canyon, that stretch of land down near the Llano River, that's something different. I was sitting in the squad car that evening, listening to the radio crackle with routine calls when I got a report about some lights out near the canyon. At first, it sounded like one of those calls you get late at night, someone seeing things. Maybe a car's headlights shining through the trees. But something in the dispatcher's voice made me pause. Sheriff, it's not like anything I've ever heard. It's like lanterns or something, floating above the ground. Now I've been doing this job long enough to know the usual excuses. Drunk drivers, hallucinations, or just folks out there getting their stories mixed up. But something about that floating lantern bit got to me, so I decided to take a look for myself. I drove out to the canyon, taking the back roads where the trees hang low and the road twists like a snake. Devil's Canyon wasn't far, but it felt like the longest drive of my life. As I got closer, the air seemed to grow heavier, thicker, like the night itself was weighing me down. I reached the old dirt road that leads into the canyon, parked my car, and got out. The night was pitch black, the only light coming from the sliver of moon above me. As I made my way toward the edge of the canyon, the sounds of the usual wildlife fell away. No crickets, no owls, just dead silence. It's a kind of silence that feels unnatural, like the land itself is holding its breath. And that's when I saw it. At first, it was just a flicker like the glow of a cigarette from far off. But then it grew, and I saw it for what it really was. 3 lights, hovering above the ground, barely moving. The lights were yellow, almost like lanterns, but they didn't seem to have any source. There was no fire, no flame. They just floated. I took a step back, my hand instinctively going to my sidearm. It was a foolish thing to do, I know, but that night felt wrong from the start, and everything in me told me to turn around. But I couldn't. I couldn't leave. Something about those lights kept pulling me closer. I moved a few more feet, trying to get a better look. That's when I heard its footsteps, slow and deliberate, crunching in the gravel behind me. I spun around, my hand on the gun, but there was no one there. The air felt thick. The ground felt unstable beneath me, like I was standing on something that wasn't quite solid. The lights had moved, shifting slightly to the right, still hovering in place, but I could feel something watching me from the darkness. I stepped forward again, and that's when I saw him. A man standing just at the edge of the light. He looked like he had been out there a long time, dirty, ragged clothes, his face gaunt like he hadn't eaten in days. But it wasn't his appearance that made my skin crawl. It was his eyes, empty, black as coal, and they were locked onto me like he knew me, like he was waiting for something. I called out, asking if he needed help, but he didn't answer. He just stood there, staring at me. And that's when the air changed again. I could feel a cold wind sweeping through the canyon, despite the fact that there was no breeze. It wasn't natural. Then, in the space of a few seconds, the lights vanished. They just blinked out, one by one, like someone had turned off a switch. But the man didn't move. He didn't even blink. And suddenly, everything felt wrong. I took a step back, then another, slowly. But I couldn't take my eyes off the man. And that's when he spoke. "Go back. It's not for you." The voice was low, almost a whisper, but it carried through the canyon like a shout. And the worst part was, I knew he wasn't talking about the lights. He was talking about me. The canyon wasn't done with me yet. I couldn't tell you how I managed to turn around, but I did. My feet were moving faster than they ever had before, and I didn't stop until I was back in my car. My hands were shaking as I started the engine and drove out of there, my eyes constantly flicking to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see him standing there, following me. I didn't tell anyone about that night. Not then. Not for a long time. What was I supposed to say? That I saw a man with empty eyes standing in the middle of a canyon while lanterns floated around him. People would have thought I was losing my mind. But the thing is, I've heard the same story from other folks since then, people who are out there, near Devil's Canyon, late at night. They saw the lights. They saw the man. Some of them even claim to have heard his voice. And I'll tell you this much, I don't go near that place anymore. Not after what I saw. The land around there, it's got its own kind of power. And if you're not careful, it'll call you back. It'll wait, just like it waited for me. And if you listen too closely, you might just hear it whisper your name.